for me, was fairly clear cut. This person is not black. And, there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing about how to say that. And I understand that because we're talking about a category that essentially does not exist biologically, that, it's difficult to say this person doesn't belong on the basis of something that is actually real. However, the experience, the historical experience that created the community that we know of as African Americans in this country now, with the entire spectrum of appearance that goes along with that, that is something that is very real, and she's not part of that lineage and that tradition. And so I think that were it simply to say, like, we can identify in any kind of way that we want, I don't think she would have to take the extra step of inventing a parent that would kind of vouch for her belonging within this community. The other thing that I think is really cynical about this, and probably this element of this story that I found most disturbing, is that, I taught in Moscow. I was on a Fulbright about 5 years ago, and one of the questions that people had was, how is it that someone who, the entire range of complexions would all be counted as black, like a black person who looks like Halle Berry, a black person who looks like Viola Davis, and someone who looks even lighter than Halle Berry. How do they all fit into the same category? And I had to talk about the ugly truth, which is the amount of institutionalized rape that happened in slavery. And so with African Americans, we don't typically check ID at the door, so to speak. People can look in a variety of different ways and still be considered part of this community. So for someone who has spent as much time around black people as Ms. Dolezal has, she certainly knows that there's a painful history around this. She knows why people don't raise questions because, in my own family, there are people who are nearly white and people who are very dark, and we're coming from the same parentage. And so that happens in black families. And so for her to take advantage of that, I think, and to use that as a means by which people would not, second guess her identity, I thought that was particularly pernicious and cynical.
But what about this, when you mentioned the surprise that you had over the firestorm this has created, isn't there somewhat a commentary about the way our society deals with issues of race, that it's almost as if it's an individual spectacle rather than the institutional manifestations, and in this particular case that there's such a fixation. Now there's even reports today that she's involved in negotiations to have a reality show as a result of the huge attention the media has focused on her?
Right. I mean, there's the man bites dog element of this, and I think that's probably about the level of significance that this particular case has. And this is not to take away anything from the work that she did or her affinity for the culture or her connections to very close familial connections to people who are black. Those things are all fine, but I think it takes another step to say that you are in fact part of this lineage when in fact you aren't. And I think that's one side element. But we saw the same thing with Donald Sterling, where all the very troubling issues around housing discrimination that had been associated with him for a really long time didn't register in the same way that a kind of weird at-home rant about what he does and how significant he is vis-a-vis black people to basketball, and that was what we got our ire about. And so that is pretty much the way that we discuss race here, as spectacle, as opposed to systemic, institutionalized dynamic that determines and influences the outcomes and opportunities of people's lives.
Interestingly, Jelani Cobb, you write about the history of the NAACP. I mean, she was the, chapter president of the NAACP in Spokane. It's not a paid position. But you talk about the founding of the NAACP.
Right, certainly. And there are, when Marcus Garvey, the early 20th century black nationalist, he criticized the NAACP. He said it was an organization full of white people and black people who look like white people. And so, I mean, there have been, black people who have a range of complexions, and including up to Walter White, who was the executive director of the NAACP for 2 decades. And Walter White had blonde hair and blue eyes. And his skin was so light that he was actually able to investigate lynchings, and he'd go to places and ask simply what happened, and people would talk to him because they thought they were talking to a white person. And so there is this dynamic that has happened previously, and I think that's kind of the thing that makes this story a little bit more complicated, which is to say, there are people who look like her who belong to this community. And it seems that it becomes a point where you almost seem like you're splitting hairs to say, well, someone can look exactly like her, but if they don't have African ancestry or they don't have experience, Walter White in this case, his parents were enslaved, and he witnessed the 1906 Atlanta race riot, those things kind of shaped him and grounded him in what exactly the black community was experiencing. To simply say, I use the brown crayon, therefore I'm black, is kind of insulting to that.